Well, welcome. I guess since we're 8 feet apart, we can take these off till we go to leave the studio. The last show we did with our friendly senator, I had promised that we'd have it in 2 parts. 1, a Senate update, and 2, a candidate update. I monopolized all 58 minutes on the Senate update to learn what he's doing for us here in Milford. So we're back to finish off. This will be a short show, but to finish off the promise of giving Brian some time to talk about his candidacy. So why don't we start there?
Well, thank you, Al. I appreciate you taking the time to let me come back on, and all your viewers as well. I'm Ryan Fattman. For those of you who don't know me, I am running for re-election for the Worcester-Norfolk State Senate District, which includes 14 towns total, 13 in Worcester County, 1 in Norfolk County and Bellingham, and of course, the center of the universe, Milford. It's been an honor and a privilege for me to be the state senator for the last 3 terms, 6 years. I've always said that, it's one of the greatest honors of my life, but the greatest honor I will ever know is being a husband and a father. And, when you grow up with the last name Fattman, you get called a lot of things. Most of my life, I never thought I'd be called state senator, but I always dreamed of being called husband and dad. And it's through those lenses that I see my job, making sure that my kids have the best education opportunities available so that other people's children can have those same opportunities, making sure we live in a safe society where we know that our police, our fire, our EMTs are supporting us and that we're also supporting and respecting them, and just making sure that our economy is as strong as it can be. These are challenges, all 3 things I just mentioned, that I believe we have a lot of work to do in the coming 2 years, and that the next state senator from this district, which I hope will be me, I will be working directly and be involved in.
So we start with the same question that we've asked you now, how many years?
Well, this is 6, so.
I was going to say, it's got to be this is term number 3?
This is term 3. I'd be running for my 4th. And I'll have to check in with my wife after that about a 5th, if that's possible. But I've really enjoyed the job. Most of the thing I enjoy the most are the people. Being able to represent the Blackstone Valley Extended is really a wonderful thing. And there's amazing businesses, there's amazing people, we have great schools, and it's a real flourishing area, especially as we go into a redistricting and census time period. The district may change a little bit, you never know, but it's been a real honor to represent it.
Let me bring it back to what is nearest and dearest to my heart. Ryan, I'm from Milford. Why should I vote for you?
I believe in making Massachusetts an affordable and accountable place to live, and that trickles down to communities like Milford. Milford has done an amazing job with its budgeting practices year after year after year. That is the buoyancy of a lot of good local people chipping in, doing it for free, volunteering their time. On the state level, that is going to be the #1 issue over the next 2 years, the state budget, and how the economy has been impacted by COVID-19 and the pandemic. For me, I've watched a lot of my friends who own businesses in this town and abroad really struggle with some of the regulations that are put into place, and they recognize it's to keep people safe. But they also recognize that there's a period of time in which we have to continue to move forward and make sure that they can serve their customers and that society can get back to a normalcy that everyone is proud of and respects. That is something that I think is going to be key over the next 2 years. I think it's key in this election cycle, just making sure we recognize that we still have the highest unemployment rate in the nation, which means, which was 16%, it's now down to 11. But if you look at sort of statistics in our area, we usually have a little bump up. So it might be 11 statewide, but right here, it's probably still 16 in a real unemployment rate. That's something that our friends and our family and our neighbors and people that we need to help get back to work. We have to encourage smart planning in doing all these things, and also making sure that businesses are supported by our government. I think that, if we just say, sorry, these are the regulations, and, throw a book at them and not really work with our businesses, that's a major problem.
So how do you balance. I mean, safety and economic viability. You know, to say we're going to keep everything closed, everybody stay home,
Yeah,
probably the safest bet.
yeah.
But then if they starve,
Yeah, I think there was a great lesson that I learned in being a local leader during the process of COVID-19. Number one was personal protective equipment. We didn't have enough. No one did. We never anticipated this happening, I think, to the magnitude that it did. But, you know, I talked on a regular basis to the 2 community hospitals in my district. You know, obviously Milford Regional and Harrington out in Southbridge and Webster. And you know, speaking to them and understanding how much PPE they went through. You know, we would hear numbers like, oh, 2 million masks or, you know, N95 masks or gowns or whatever. And what the reality is when those are distributed statewide, they're gone in a day. And that's, I think, something a lot of people didn't recognize. We had tremendous victories, they're not to be downplayed, where the Patriots were involved, the governor was involved, and it made for great headlines and good results. But there was a diminishing effect on those because they went away so quickly. This state should have a bank of personal protective equipment that's a strategic bank. We never considered that in the past. We should have that for personal protective equipment, and we should have it for oil too. You know, these are things that Massachusetts state government can do, that the legislature can do, and work in conjunction with the administration. The federal government does have these things. But I also think we've seen a federal government take things that we had ordered. You know, Representative Brian Murray and I, we decided to get involved when 10,000 pieces of personal protective equipment, which were ordered by this town, were confiscated by the federal government with no warning. You know, that's unacceptable. And we need to work in a bipartisan manner. We have to plan better for these types of events, and we need to make sure we have strategic reserves set aside that when another event like this does come, hopefully not in the future, because I think that will drive us all crazy.
yeah, this should be a once-in-a-lifetime event.
We really would hope. But, you know, you have to also look at, I think, that statement from my generation's perspective to an extent. I don't know how many younger people are watching right now, but back in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, a lot of people from my generation were told, oh, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. You know, this economy, the way, you know, you've been promised a set of outcomes if you go to college and you do the right thing, and that didn't come to fruition. And this is sort of the second time that we're told it's a once-in-a-generation event. I think the reality is we just don't know. And we have to be prepared, and we have to be diligent, and we have to be fiscally responsible. You know, I think we have to put in laws into place that help encourage savings so that people are able to, you know, withstand potential time periods where times are tough. Something that I have supported numerous times is using the tax code in Massachusetts to encourage savings, whether it be for healthcare finances, for college finances, expanding that, or just for trying to buy your first house. And these are the types of things, you know, that we should modify. Not just a savings account for your first house, but once you've purchased that first house, continue to put money in potentially tax-free so that if we do have an issue where you lose your job, you can put that money and tap into it when you need to pay your mortgage because you've lost that job. You know, those are the types of things that I think we need to get innovative in government about, and we can't rest on our laurels.
Well, I mean, when I think what you just said, PPE, when you desperately need it, you can't buy it.
Right.
I mean, my family was, I won't say saved, but aided from a customer in China of ours who read all the bad publicity we were getting, and next thing you know, a little box showed up with 200 masks.
Right.
You know, by the time you divvy them out, like you said, you think you got a world supply, but then when you think of all your friends and family and everybody, they went pretty quick, but at least we had them.
Yeah. And one of the things that I decided to do, I said, I learned this because I started talking to the hospitals, the nurses. They were saying, oh, we don't have this stuff. We feel nervous about going into our work environment. You know, I've got a Rolodex of contacts that I've made over the last 6 years, from Consigli Construction to Koopman Lumber to a bunch of businesses and good people in between. And I started calling them and being like, hey, guys, do you got extra supplies? Do you have the ability to make this stuff? You know, ventilators, repurposing some of the machinery that places like Lamping Corporation in Uxbridge were utilizing, they easily just make a few switches. They have parts for ventilators. I did everything in my power to reach out to the business community to chip in to this public health crisis and try to make sure that our hospitals were supplied, that our businesses were mobile and agile to help address certain needs in the community. And some of the results were really amazing. I reached out to the Barton Center, which is a diabetic camp out in Oxford and Charlton, which is a little bit beyond my district, but Oxford is. And they had over 100,000 alcohol swabs just for cleaning, simple cleaning test kits, cleaning surfaces. We were able to get those split between Harrington Hospital and Milford Regional. They also had over 100,000 pairs of gloves. Don't forget, they didn't go back to camp, so they didn't need these supplies. And they repurposed them and put them into our hospitals. I talked to dog groomers. Actually, one dog grooming company that just shut down, they had a bunch of Tyvek suits that they used to use. Maybe they're not quite Tyvek, but one step below. Mm-hmm. And we got them all donated over to Milford Hospital. So I really dug in and did everything that I could from that perspective, including going on social media and making pleas for help to the public. And people responded. It was incredible. A young man from Bellingham whose name was Patrick. I'm trying to remember his last name, but Patrick made over 300 face masks, just by his own goodwill, and chipped in to get those to hospitals. But the reality is we learned a good lesson. We're not prepared. This will happen again. Hopefully it's not soon. But down the road, we need to be ready, and that's something I hope to be part of that solution.
Now, when you say be ready with oil, to me, that's just money. There's not been a shortage of oil.
Yeah. So what's really interesting is the oil markets crashed back early in this whole pandemic. Basically, you had to give it away.
Right.
And I know a bunch of people in that industry who are really concerned. I didn't understand how the refineries work and how the oil fields work out in Oklahoma and Texas, the federal licensing with some of those. And there was a great deal of concern that they would get shut down, they would stop, and they would have to renew or rewrite new leases, and that could cause a real problem long term. Some people still believe that. And so I started thinking, the federal government does have a reserve of this. Why wouldn't the Massachusetts state government just have a strategic reserve? And we don't. And the reality is we need to get to that point. We need to make sure that people are prepared, whether it be oil for a cold winter. Imagine if this had all played out at a time period combined with some others.
If it started now.
Yeah, right. It could have been disastrous on multiple levels. So I just think we need to think strategically and long-term and be prepared. We've started to do this fiscally in our state. The governor, to his credit, with conjunction in the legislature, something I support, put as much money away in our savings rainy day fund as possible. When you think that's a good idea and consider why, we should do that with other things as well. And I think that that's one of the lessons that I've learned through the pandemic experience.
Well, that makes sense. You could do that by just putting money away and earmarking it, saying this is for oil.
Yep, you could do that. That's one option. I think there's a lot on the table. I also think
the problem is you have to have the money.
You do. And, we have $3.6 billion that we've put away in the rainy day fund. Since I've been in the legislature, we've put about 2.6 of that away. And some people said, what this program and that program, and let's spend money on that because it's
we got it, let's spend it.
Yeah, it's a well worth endeavor. And the reality is, it may be, but fiscal responsibility is about making sure you have a budget and a plan. And when a time comes when things aren't good, like right now, that you have money set aside for that rainy day. And I'm proud that we've put that money away because it's going to help us weather the storm when it comes to education funding, when it comes to public safety funding. I know Milford is in a great position, and it always, I think, will be with the right people involved. But the reality is not every town is situated like Milford, where there's a thriving commercial and industrial base that, helps the town run.
Well, you're always going to have the issue, because even us with our stabilization account, we've been criticized so many times that we ought to be spending it. But then when the Woodland School came, and we didn't have to use profanity, those Prop 2.5 overrides or debt exclusion, it felt really good that if we needed it, it was there.
Right. You mentioned, Prop 2.5 or override schools. I think one of the disappointments for me, from a policy perspective, is sort of the state Department of Education leading from behind in many ways over the course of the last few months. I've been disappointed that there wasn't a plan put together. Like, school stopped in March, as we know it. And in some places, it's returned to some normalcy, but in many places, it has not. And what I thought was an opportunity for the Department of Early and Secondary Education is to go out and to talk to the various school districts and to say, hey, we might go back into a hybrid type system or a virtual learning type system. We're going to prepare for that. We're going to train the teachers for that. We're going to train administrators. And if we can figure out a way to create a really good hybrid system that can balance the needs of everybody, let's do that. Or we can figure out a way to get all the kids back into the schools. We're going to do that. There was silence for a good 3 or 4 months that the Department of Early and Secondary Education did nothing. And I think the consequences of that play out really hard for families when, school districts, who rightfully so are trying to figure this out, mostly with volunteer school committee members and, full-time administrators, but the state could have stepped in, they could have done more to give guidance and best practices, and they didn't. And I think the families of, Massachusetts are paying the consequences of that. I can't imagine. I've talked to a lot of my peers whose children are a little bit older than mine. I'm blessed. At this point, I'm blessed to have healthy children, love them to death, but they're 4, 2.5, and 9 months. They're not in the public schools. And, I would be devastated to watch my 5-year-old or 6-year-old be trying to learn virtually and see the horror stories that play out, and then mom and dad trying to balance work and trying to go back to work. And I think the state, not necessarily the localities and the municipalities, but the state could have done more to try to create a plan, institute better virtual learning practices, help teachers, and they didn't do that. And I think that, it's really failed. One of the biggest failures that I've seen that needs to be addressed moving forward.
Well, I don't understand today what the outcome is going to be. Because you do this hybrid thing.
Right.
The minute one kid, in my mind, comes in with COVID, you wipe out the class.
Right.
You hit the teacher, who may have kids in other schools. The dominoes start flying.
Yep.
But even if nothing happened and everything goes along well, there's a lot of people out there that are making it, but they don't have a lot of room to spare.
Right.
So, if your children were in school and you're going to have them home 3 days a week, how does that happen? If they're teenagers, okay,
right,
they can take care of themselves. But first graders, second grader, elementary kids.
Yeah.
I guess you have to pay somebody to stay home, or you have to take time out of work.
Yeah, and this is just, I'm identifying it because I think it's one of the public policy failures that Massachusetts did not take on, that it should have. I've started reading methodologies in which, other states have tried to implement better education practices. But I think it's a real problem and something that we had time. We had time to plan and we failed to do so. Even just, equipping schools with the personal protective equipment, making sure that they had what they needed. I don't think that enough was done on that front.
Well, I know a lot of school districts didn't know how to locate PPE.
Yep.
Because I got a call and it said, we can't get our hands on N95 masks. Okay. So I delivered a case.
Right.
We can't get children's N95s. They don't make them. They make N95s, kids version. So I got them. So, a lot of it, I think, was just training. And like you say, I would have hoped that the state anticipated or got in front of some of these issues.
Yeah. One of the things that I've worked hard on, and it's about planning and just looking at the playing field and understanding, okay, this is where I represent. May not be the same area that somebody else represents. though a lot of the state falls into this bucket. I've worked on legislation to provide AEDs in every police vehicle in municipal police vehicles. And I've done that trying to create a trust fund and a funding mechanism to make sure that what happened to David Greenwood over in Mendon never happens to anybody again. The police in Mendon are amazing. At the time, though, 3 years ago, when they showed up and he was in cardiac arrest, they didn't have an AED. And his daughter, Erica, was there trying to save his life. She was an EMT. And the first question she asked the first responder, the police officer, was, do you have an AED? And he said, I don't. And at that moment, she knew it was over. And so that experience that's so local and sad has turned into this major initiative to try to get AEDs in police vehicles. I think that if you were to poll most people, they would say, oh yeah, we got AEDs in our schools, we got AEDs in our police vehicles, we got AEDs in our fire vehicles, why wouldn't we? But the reality is a lot of police vehicles don't. And it's not a large cost, but our idea was putting stake in the game for the municipalities and the state, doing matching grants, requiring it over the course of a 10-year period of time. I'd like to do it a lot quicker than that, and hopefully we will, because there's tons of private enterprise out there and foundations that will help fund this. But working locally to try to make sure we look at a situation where we know in our area, for the most part, Milford might be an exception in my district in Bellingham, but when you're in Hopedale or in Mendon or in Millville or Blackstone or Oxford or Sutton or Northbridge, Dudley, the first person showing up to an emergency is a police officer. They are full-time. Every town in my district has full-time police, and they're going to respond the quickest. And if they don't have an AED and you're in a cardiac incident, you're dead.
But isn't this like, you think back years ago, this new concept of the jaws of life. Mm-hmm. And everybody said, we ought to have those available no matter what.
Right.
And it started as a quiet, small movement that just kept going and going.
Yep.
And you think of how many lives have been saved.
Absolutely. Yep.
And you can argue, well, it's not that many. Well, if it's your father, your mother,
yep,
that's one too many.
But it's also, a really good public policy practice when you start looking at the statistics, because in a vacuum, you're absolutely right. When it's your child, when it's your dad, it's the worst experience possible. But if you look at Massachusetts's resuscitation rate and survival rate in cardiac incidents, in central Massachusetts, we have one of the lowest in the nation, which is abysmal when you think about it, because we have some of the best healthcare institutions in the nation. And I bring this up because there was a study done out in Minnesota where they equipped in one county every every police vehicle with an AED. And the survival rates increased by 80%. 80%. That is incredible. And so we know that within a short period of time, you have probably a 3-minute window where in a cardiac incident, you got to get them resuscitated. You got to get the electrical systems of the body working again. And it takes, on average, 3 or 4 minutes for local police to respond to an emergency incident, sometimes a little bit longer in a larger town. So every minute that goes by, you start having a drop-off rate for success in that person's life.
Well, remember we had Jeff Hopkins, the head of our emergency department here, and he talked about, I'm a man, I can weather through anything. I'm having a stroke, I'll see through it. And he said, you're losing 1 million brain cells a minute.
Yeah.
And you sat there and said, oh, and those don't regenerate.
Yeah.
So it's not even loss of life.
Yep.
People who survive it, if they have to hold off for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes,
yeah,
the quality of life can be dramatically reduced.
Absolutely.
How much is an AED?
These days, $1,200 at the most.
So we have 12 patrol cars in our town. We're talking 15,000 whole dollars.
Yeah. Yep. And they're usually good for a 2-year period of time. And some of the new ones are longer. And then you just have to replace the
$7,000
batteries.
a year.
Yeah, I mean, it's peanuts to keep people alive, and make sure that our communities are safe, you know? And that's really, I say, you have to look at the playing field you're on. You know, our playing field is different than Boston. It's different than Worcester. And we have to make
But
sure we
Ryan,
equip our
even those
towns.
towns where, I mean, we're blessed in Milford that, you know, I mean, this year we'll have a $5 million surplus.
Yeah,
So it wouldn't be hard
no,
to
not at all.
make the case.
Yep,
But even if I was hurting and I got no surplus and I got a budget that's only, you know, a few $1 million,
yep.
$7,000?
Yeah. No, exactly, and this is my point. The playing field I'm talking about is the area you live. And you have to know that the first responders are your police officers. A lot of times the EMTs are falling behind, but a lot of towns, they have part-time EMS service, or they have full-time EMS service for a regional basis.
But I'm thinking
So
if you
we
got
need to
the
get these
word
police
out,
officers.
because I'll bet a lot of people don't understand that they're talking about $7,000, or these smaller towns less.
Right.
Because they won't have 12 police cars, they'll have 6.
Yeah, right, exactly.
You
Yep.
know, so just like, you know, when we first heard the jaws of
Or
life.
two.
Or two.
You know?
You know, you heard the jaws of life, it was like, okay, what is that?
Yeah,
Then once you started understanding what it was,
yep.
I don't remember the price being the obstacle.
Yeah.
It was the understanding of why we should have this.
Yeah. No, and that's the thing. I think, you know, the town of Mendon, they've instituted this as a policy. I know Milford has, Hopedale has. You know, everyone's trying to take steps in the right direction, but I do get concerned when you go further out into Western Mass. And, you know, it would be great to have this as a statewide policy. I also think, you know, unfortunately, sometimes tragedy influences the direction you try to take public policy in. There's a young woman named Amanda Dombrowski who lost her life really tragically 2 Julys ago, and she was stabbed to death in O'Connor's restaurant in Worcester. She was my constituent. Her family is my constituent. I actually used to live a stone's throw away from them in Webster, and we've been trying to change a law to make it so that if you're a temp worker, you know, to try to support temp workers, that if you're a victim of domestic violence, that you can't be terminated. There's a loophole in the law. The law states that you should, if you are a victim of domestic violence, that you can't be terminated for not showing up to work. There's a 30-day period of time. You can provide a doctor's note. You know, and that makes sense, right? You know, that is a law that makes tremendous sense. But if you're a temporary employee, you actually are not covered by that law. And Amanda Dombrowski was a temporary employee working at Bristol-Myers Squibb, and she was assaulted in early April and ended up of that year, 2019, and she you know, said, I can't come to work. I had lacerations on my hands. Somebody broke into my house, you know, at 5 in the morning on Easter Sunday, and I can't come to work. And, you know, a few days later, she was fired by the company. And that set off a whole tailspin of events in her life that eventually led to her death. That doesn't happen. I feel very confident she's still alive and here today, and her parents feel the same exact way. It's a young woman, full of life. I believe she's 30 years old. And, you know, this is just a person robbed of their life. But you find in it an injustice. You know, she should have never been able to lose her job. In fact, she lost her job before the person who assaulted her lost his, and they work for the same company. How's that right? So, you know, again, almost like a workers' rights type issue, an employee that was, you know, written off and disrespected, and the law didn't protect her. You know, and a local girl that was just trying to do right by her community and her family.
Along the same lines, we keep talking about extending the non-eviction law. Your thoughts?
So right now it's till October 17th. I understand in the original sort of rubble of all the pandemic why that was really important. I think October 17th is where we need to start saying, okay, let's put this back in a direction where people are paying their rents, their mortgages, and we're going back to a normalcy. There's a tremendous amount of concern, especially I talk to a lot of people who are landlords, you know, that have invested in property as a means of retirement or who have invested in property as a means of funding their children's education. And they want to do everything they can and work with people, but they're heavily concerned about, you know, extending this. There's been proposals to extend it all the way into 2021 beyond the summer. And that is economically devastating in many ways.
I understand protecting the tenant.
Mm-hmm.
You know, everybody wants to help, and they bring out the single mom and all. But what happens to the mom and pop who have a duplex?
Right.
And they need the rent to pay the mortgage because the banks aren't going to forgive rent.
Right.
And what I don't understand is if somebody just gets up and leaves.
Yeah.
Okay, so I own the house, you owe me X thousands of dollars of rent. Your net worth is $32.80. What am I going to do, sue you for all $32?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the question you asked before, it's about finding the balance. And you can't collapse the entire economic system that's been built in this country over a 200+ year period of time, you know, in a 6-month period of time or 8-month period of time. The amount of pain that is driven from just those actions is great. And I've watched people who have built small businesses, restaurants, bars, you know, service, like hardware service stores that were not deemed essential, but yet their big box competitor was, just suffer. And that to me is something that really needs to be addressed moving forward. I think the governor, as much as I like the governor personally and think he's taken a really tough circumstance and done the best that he can, you know, unprecedented circumstances, I think he has too much power. I get very nervous about one individual having tremendous authority. And I don't care, you know, what your last name is. I care about your title, executive. In this country, in our state, for the most part, we led the American Revolution. And we said we're very concerned about one individual having so much authority. Governor Baker has utilized the Civil Defense Act of 1953 to respond to many of the challenges that the pandemic has faced. That's in court right now. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I believe they're trying to expedite the decision by sometime in early October about whether that was an appropriate means to use. I think what my concern is that the legislature, the people's branch of government, has had virtually zero say in many of the decisions that are being made. And yet we are really the closest to the people in elected office. You know, we go to the store. I have a practice of trying to go to the grocery store, you know, maybe not these days, but when things were normal, late at night. You know, I go to a 24-hour grocery store because I'd be there for 2 hours just chatting with people, seeing what was on their mind. And, you know, that is good. That's why you want people who are out representing, you know, you at events and various things that are going on in a community, because you hear from people and then you can take them back up and governing on Beacon Hill. But that system has been essentially dismantled, and that's not good. I don't think that that's good for government. I don't think it's good for transparency, and I think it's something that we need to either implement a policy that the legislature, any executive order that the governor puts into place has to be ratified by the legislature so that there's a check and balance to that power. But that's something that does concern me greatly.
Well, it worries me, and maybe I just don't understand enough, that I hear a lot of people who have rental properties saying, as soon as I can, I'm selling this place. The market's red hot.
Yep.
And whatever I take is a hit, even if I have to sell it with tenant in. Well, the buyer will wait for the law to lift, and then all of a sudden, you have one less home for people who are renting.
Yeah.
And I just get scared that a lot of the rental properties are going to disappear.
Yeah. I also think better planning, you know, this goes back to what I was saying. And if that does happen, you're absolutely right. The standard of living in our state is very expensive. If you all of a sudden decimate the rental market, which is already tough, it's going to get more expensive. You know, this is one of the key facets that I've tried to hone in on. I'm a very environmentally friendly guy. I believe in having a good environment. I really do. I want that for my children. I want clean air. I want, you know, clean water. But I also want to make sure we're putting things into place that make sense. You know, one thing I would suggest that probably didn't make sense is just a moratorium on the rents not being collected, mortgages not being collected, just as a blanket policy. If you had done some sort of incrementation of that, where it says if you're employed and nothing has changed for you, then you continue to pay.
Right.
If there's an issue, you know, maybe you'd have a different policy where you're unemployed. But, you know, we're putting in policies in place, potentially, the state Senate passed a policy, an environmental one, that would essentially require eventually solar panels on every single home in new construction. That's not a good idea. It's not a good idea because the technology is not there yet. You know, maybe one day it could be a great idea, but the technology is not there yet where the cost of the photovoltaic panels are so low that this becomes like a policy that's affordable. You know, you put in a system in place, you're talking $30,000
a house.
for the system, you know, but I mean, I'm sorry, for the panels, but you're not talking about for the system, the heating and cooling system, which is another 30
You're
to
talking
70,000
60 to 70,000 per home.
on top of what is already the highest housing
ridiculous.
market, $400,000 on average for a home in
And
Massachusetts.
see, a lot of people don't understand, and this be a topic for another day, how that affects companies. I remember when we had a company out in San Diego. We left because it was so difficult to recruit and keep people
Yeah.
because the price of housing was ridiculous.
Right.
You know, it's $300,000-$400,000 for a starter home. Well, I look around Milford, and a split level is at that level.
Yeah.
So recruiting people in and keeping them in this area starts to hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Last topic, as we finish up for today, voting. Comments on mail-in votes?
Yeah, so I support people's ability to choose, essentially. You know, I voted for a bill that had a mail-in component, very similar to what Milford did in their local election. I think that makes sense. I don't think it makes sense to mail a ballot to everybody. I think that there's problems with that. There's also cost problems with that. What does make sense is what we did in Massachusetts. We put in some safeguards. I wish we had put in a few more, where you can apply for a no-excuse absentee ballot. And as long as that ballot is signed and the appropriate due diligence is done and the clerks can handle the volume, I think that that's a good system. I will be voting in person because to me, election day is a lot more than just election day. I think about my grandfather's service to the country, shot in the leg and a Purple Heart veteran. You know, I think about my brother who flies a Black Hawk helicopter. People put their lives on the line every single day for that one moment to go and vote. I don't think it diminishes anybody who chooses to vote in another way. Just for me, that's my personal decision. So creating sort of 3 personal decision processes that people can pursue, I don't really have a problem with, as long as we have the safeguards in place. There was news out of the Secretary of State's office this weekend, actually, that if you applied through the portal that was just created by the Secretary of State, that you didn't actually have to sign electronically the application to get the ballot sent to you. You could also, by the way, change your voting address on that portal. I think that that's a little bit out there. A lot of town clerks have raised their hand and said, hey, this doesn't sound like a great system. One of the things that I wanted to do was our registrars of voters, or our commission, whatever they are called depending on the place you live, the election commissioners, I wanted them to be able to watch the observance of the ballots being processed early. We changed the law so that all ballots are processed early and that they can be taken out and inserted in the machine early. That's actually never happened in our state. We've always waited until election day. And that gave me a lot of pause and concern. I had an amendment that would say that the election commissioners would be notified to the time and the place of where that would be happening, be given at least a few hours' notice, and could, if they wanted to, show up and watch, or notify their respective political party, because a lot of people don't realize this. We usually have 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans that sit as
And watch.
And watch, and they're the election commissioners. I think that was perfectly reasonable. Unfortunately, it failed. And that's something moving forward I'd like to see happen if the mail-in voting continues.
Well, Amy Neves, our clerk, is taking care of me because I used to have an hour-and-a-half drive to work. And I started doing absentee, and she always got them to me. I always got them back. That made perfect sense. I don't understand this whole mailing a ballot to everybody on the rolls.
Yeah.
And how you control it. I'm not sure I'm for it. I'm not sure I'm against it, but I wish we had more time to understand how to build safeguards in.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that's really problematic about this period of time, is we rushed a lot of things through. We talked the last time we were on a show about the police reform bill.
Yep.
That was getting rushed through without understanding the consequences. I tried to slow that down. I did try to slow down the elections bill and changing signatures and all this stuff, because I want to make sure we get it right. There's a lot of problems in public policy that if you rush things through and get it wrong, there's consequences on the back end that you now are trying to
Now,
fix.
years later, you figure out.
Yep, and you're patching it up, and then, oh, by the way, mistakes already were made. The most prescient thing that was said during the elections hearing, I serve on the elections committee that crafted the absentee voting law, essentially, because it's not really a mail-in voting, it's an absentee, just applying what we've always had on the books, eliminating the excuses and allowing people to apply and then mail in their ballot. But the most prescient thing that was said was, the biggest concern is not the actual fraud, the execution of voter fraud. It's the perception of the integrity of the election. And that's something that really is, I think makes a tremendous amount of sense. Once you start chipping away, like, God bless her soul, but in Grafton, they had a 2.5 override on the ballot, and there was 200 ballots. I think the election was decided by less than 90 votes.
I was just under
and
100.
they had 200 ballots in the safe that hadn't been counted. And God bless the town clerk. She came out and said, hey, everybody needs to know this immediately. But that's something that undermines the credibility of the election. Fortunately, they were able to resolve it.
But that is more harmful
Yes.
than a single election.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank
Come
you for
to
having
that
me.
time. As always, I'll never ask you to vote for any specific candidate, but I'll beg you to get to know these candidates and make sure that you get out and vote. Voting is the #1 thing you can do. Pick a candidate that you believe in, that is like us. It's always pick somebody that feels right because they think like us, they deliver on promises. And once you do that, make sure you get out, whether you're doing it by mail or you're showing up at the Portuguese Club or wherever you're going. Please get out and vote. And as always, to our 6 loyal viewers, make sure you vote, and may God bless. May tomorrow be a better day than today. Thank you.
Far too long since I've been home. Been running all my life.